Montana Territory, June 1879. The horses broke loose just after first light, and by the time Margaret Kessler stumbled out into the rising dust and chaos, her entire world had already scattered across the plains. "Damn it, not again," she shouted, boots thudding against dry ground as she chased after the last flicker of a tail vanishing into the tall grass. The corral gate hung wide open, the latch twisted clean off. Likely one of the boys from the nearby mining camp had come snooping again, trying to impress each other with how close they could get to a widow's stock without getting caught. She stood there, hands on her hips, chest heaving, sweat already stinging her brow. The summer sun was only just beginning its climb, and the wind carried the faint scent of sage and coming heat. Her skirts were still tucked into her boots, and her braid was a half-finished mess down her back. She had been up earlier than usual because she had a feeling. The kind that settled behind the ribs like a warning. And now this. Everything she had left: 4 horses, a few chickens, a patch of land her husband had died trying to tame, that was all she had. And now her horses were gone too. She looked out at the land. Pale blue sky stretching endless. The mountains far off like sleeping giants. There was no one nearby to help. No neighbors for miles. Just her, and the dust, and the ache of too many hard years. Until hooves thundered over the ridge. She shielded her eyes and stared. A rider came fast, the sun catching on his hat brim. The horse beneath him dark and lean. He rode with purpose, not wandering, not lost. His duster flared behind him like wings, and his pace didn't slow one bit as he came toward her gate. He pulled his horse up with a tug and swung down in a smooth motion. Margaret blinked. "Morning," he said, voice low and rough like gravel warmed in the sun. "Saw some horses booking it west, no sign of riders. Figured someone might be missing them." She nodded, still catching her breath. "They're mine." Corral was busted overnight. He looked her over, eyes steady but not prying. "You out here alone?" "My husband died 3 winters ago. I've been managing." He nodded once. "Name's Nolan Oakes. Margaret Kessler." He glanced out past her shoulder, toward the direction the horses had run. "I can go after them." She hesitated. "That's nearly a day's ride. Maybe more." "I was heading that way anyhow," he said. "I'll bring them back. You do not even know me." "I do not need to." And then he was back in the saddle, already turning his horse with a sharp whistle. Dust kicked up behind him as he rode out, and Margaret stood there, heart pounding, watching until he disappeared into the horizon. She spent the day working the land like she always did, with her sleeves rolled up and her jaw tight. But she could not stop thinking about him. The way he had not asked anything of her. The way he had looked at her like she was not just a tired widow. That night, she barely slept. The wind howled through the broken corral, and she kept listening for hoofbeats that never came. By sunrise, she was out front again, coffee in hand, waiting. Then, just as the sky turned gold, she saw movement. 4 horses. 1 man. Nolan. He led the animals gently, walking beside them, dust coating his boots and jawline. He looked tired but calm. One of the horses had a small gash on its flank, nothing serious, but he had wrapped it with a torn piece of his own shirt. Margaret's throat tightened. She stepped forward, eyes wide. "You found all of them," she said. "Took some doing. That gray one's smart. Doubled back on me twice." She reached for the reins, fingers brushing his. "Thank you." He met her eyes, slow and steady. "Glad I could help." She realized then just how close he was standing. And how long it had been since someone looked at her like she mattered. "Let me make you breakfast," she said. "I'd like that." Inside, the cabin was small but clean. She cracked eggs into a pan while he leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her with quiet curiosity. "You always live this far out?" he asked. "Came here with my husband when I was 20. We thought the land would be enough." She shrugged. "I stayed after he passed. It is home now." He nodded. "I get that." She set the plate in front of him. "Why were you riding west?" "You said you were heading that way. Work dried up near Helena. Figured I'd keep moving till I found something better." I got no one waiting on me. Margaret sat across from him, her fingers wrapped around her coffee cup. Well, you found my horses. That seems like something. He smiled just a little. Yeah, guess it does. They ate in silence for a while. Comfortable. Easy. Afterward, he helped her fix the corral. Just the two of them hammering in new boards, replacing the broken latch. He did not talk much, but when he did, she listened. And when she spoke, he did not interrupt. By the time the sun was high and the fence was done, her hands were aching, but her heart felt lighter. As they walked back to the porch, she touched his arm. You could stay a few days. Rest. He looked at her, long and thoughtful. You sure? I am. He nodded. Then I'll stay. That night, he slept in the barn. She brought him a blanket, and when their fingers brushed again, something shifted between them. Not fast. But sure. Like the horses who had finally come home. And the cowboy who had brought them back. By the third morning, Margaret found herself setting aside a second cup of coffee before she even realized she was doing it. Nolan hadn't said he'd stay longer than a few days, but he hadn't said he was leaving either. And she hadn't asked. The quiet between them had grown into something companionable, like a well-worn trail, uncharted but steady underfoot. He was already outside, mending a loose hitch post with a focused patience that made her pause in the doorway. His coat hung on a nail, sleeves rolled high, revealing a long scar running along his forearm, pale against sun-brown skin. She didn't ask about it. Not yet. You sleep all right? She asked, setting the cup beside him. Well enough. He took it without looking up, testing the post with a firm push. This land's got a stillness to it. Makes your thoughts louder. She leaned against the porch rail, watching the slow sway of the grass. Loud thoughts ever do you any good? Sometimes, he said. Sometimes they just remind you what you've lost. She didn't answer right away. The wind pressed at her skirts, pulling faintly toward the open hills. What was hers name? Nolan's grip on the post stilled. He didn't look at her, but his voice was measured. Sarah, my wife, died back in Kansas. Fever took her fast. Margaret nodded once, eyes on the horizon. My husband drowned crossing the big hole. Ice hadn't melted clean yet. He thought he could make it. They didn't speak after that. Not for a while. The morning wore on as they worked, she tending the rows of beans still stunted from a late frost. He hauling stones from the edge of the field and stacking them in neat piles. The rhythm of the labor filled the space between them, wordless but not unkind. Later, they sat on the back stoop eating bread she'd baked 2 days earlier. He pulled a folded scrap of paper from his coat and studied it absently. What's that? She asked. Map. Old cattle route. I was thinking of heading west toward the Judith Basin. There's talk of a rancher needing hands. She stared at the piece of bread in her lap. How long till you go? He folded the paper slowly. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe the day after. You don't owe me your time, she said. I know. But neither of them stood. That evening a storm crawled over the mountains. Not thunder, just a steady drizzle that turned the earth soft and the air thick with damp sage. She lit a lamp inside and found Nolan just outside the barn, brushing down his gelding by lantern light. You'll catch cold out here, she said, holding a second oil lamp. He didn't move. He spooked earlier. Figured I'd settle him proper before I turn in. She stepped closer, the rain slicking her hair. You're good with him. I was raised around horses. My father ran a freight team out of Abilene. Taught me never to trust a man who doesn't check his horse's hooves. Margaret smiled faintly. Sounds like a man who'd have a thing or two to say about a widow trying to run a ranch alone. Nolan finally turned. He'd have said you had grit. That's what he called women who kept going after the worst happened. She met his gaze steady. And what do you say? His eyes didn't waver. I say you're not alone anymore. The lantern light flickered between them, catching the rain in little golden sparks. For a long moment, neither moved. Then she handed him the second lamp. Come inside when you're done. She left the door open behind her. He came in not long after, footsteps quiet on the wooden floor. She was pouring hot water into the wash basin, steam curling in the lamplight. Without a word, she handed him a clean towel and turned away, giving him space. He washed up, and when he joined her at the table, she was sewing a tear in her work skirt. He sat across from her, watching her hands move with practiced grace. "You always sew by lamplight?" "Only when I don't want to think too much." He leaned back, fingers laced across his stomach. "What would you do if you didn't have to hold this place together all on your own?" She looked up. "I don't know. I've never let myself wonder." He nodded slowly. "Maybe you should." Outside, the rain eased and the wind fell still. Inside, the silence between them shifted, no longer empty but waiting. Margaret set down her needle. "You can have the bed tonight. I'll take the chair. I'm fine in the barn." "I know. But I'm offering." He hesitated. "You sure?" She nodded. "I trust you." The words settled between them like a promise. He took the bed that night, but only after she insisted again. She curled up in the rocker by the fire, blanket wrapped tight, eyes on the dying coals. She didn't sleep much, but she didn't need to. The man who'd ridden into her life had stayed, and for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't waiting on silence to answer back. By the time the creek behind the ridge ran full with snowmelt, Nolan had cleared the north fence line, patched the sagging west wall of the barn, and built a new chicken coop door that didn't bang in the wind. Each task he finished without being asked. Margaret noticed how he moved through her days like he belonged there, never loud, never idle. They ate most meals seated across from one another. But by late June, she'd taken to sliding the bench around the table, so they sat side by side. He never commented on the shift, and neither did she. That morning, she found him kneeling beside the old root cellar, one hand pressed flat to the damp wood. "Something wrong?" she asked, wiping her palms on her apron. "Boards underneath are starting to rot. Won't last through another winter." She stepped closer, peering down. "I never stored much down there anyway. You might if it held. I can replace it." Margaret crouched beside him, knees creaking slightly. "You planning to stay that long?" Nolan didn't look at her. "I haven't decided yet." She rose then, brushing off her skirts. "Well, I suppose I'll fix it either way." That afternoon, she took the wagon into town for flour and lamp oil. The trip was long and the sun high, but she needed the quiet to think. When she returned, Nolan had already laid out new planks by the cellar, cut and sanded, ready to go. She didn't ask how he'd managed it without a sawmill nearby. Instead, she poured him a tin cup of cold water and handed it over. "You found the cedar behind the ridge, didn't you?" He took the cup. "There's a stand of it just past the bluff. Dry, but it'll hold." She leaned against the wagon. Not many men would trouble themselves with that. He sipped and set the cup down. "I don't see the sense in leaving something half done." That night, the wind pushed harder than usual. Margaret stood at the stove while Nolan lit the second lamp near the window. "You ever think about what you'd be doing if you hadn't come here?" she asked, keeping her hands busy over the pot. "I reckon I'd be somewhere colder, sleeping under a wagon bed." He turned to her. "But I'm glad I'm not." She stirred slowly. "I've gotten used to you being around." He crossed the room and stood behind her, not touching, but near enough she felt the warmth of him at her back. "I've gotten used to you too." Outside, the rain began light, steady, and sure. He cleared his throat. "I passed the old trail markers south of the property this morning. Someone's been using them again." "Hunters?" she asked. "Could be. Or someone driving cattle through." She turned. "You think we need to worry?" "No. But it wouldn't hurt to walk the southern edge of the land tomorrow. Make sure no one's cutting through." She nodded. "I'll come with you." At dawn, they left on foot, walking the rise above the southern edge. The grass was high, the air still, and the only sound was their boots pressing into the damp earth. "You always walk this land?" Nolan asked after a while. "Only when I need to remember what I've kept." He glanced at her. "You ever think about selling it?" "Not once." They stopped when they reached the old boundary post, its top split from wind and time. Margaret ran her hand over the weathered wood. My husband carved this, she said. Took him a week. Said a man ought to know where his life begins and ends. Nolan crouched down, adjusting the stone at its base. Looks like someone kicked this loose. She knelt beside him, her shoulder brushing his. You think they meant anything by it? Could have been a cow straying, or someone testing your lines. She studied him. You're not just a wanderer, are you? He met her gaze. No, not always. The sky above them stretched wide and pale blue, the kind of color that only came after rain. She stood first, brushing dew from her skirt. I'll cook tonight, he said as they made their way back. You don't have to. I want to. That evening, the scent of beans and salt pork filled the cabin. Margaret sat on the porch steps, the last of the sun warming her face. Nolan joined her with 2 plates balanced on his arms. We could build another room off the back, he said, handing one to her. She blinked. What for? He looked out over the pasture. Just seems right. You've got enough space. She took a long moment before answering. If you stay, it would need to be your home too. He set his plate down. Then I'll build it strong. They sat there until the light faded, and neither of them moved inside until the stars had scattered across the sky like ash. That night, he didn't go out to the barn. Instead, he stood by the hearth, watching her as she folded the quilt on the rocker. Margaret. She looked up, her name soft in his mouth. I'm not leaving. Not anymore. She stepped closer, her voice quieter than the fire's crackle. Then this is your place now, too. He reached for her hand. When their fingers met, the space between them vanished. And in that quiet cabin, with the land holding steady around them, something long buried rose up and took root, sure as cedar, sure as morning. The chimney needed rebricking. Nolan had noticed it the morning after the rain how the mortar had crumbled along the eastern edge, let in a faint draft. He didn't mention it right away. Just made a note in his mind alongside the lean in the south fence and the way the door to the smokehouse stuck in the heat. Margaret was in the root cellar, sorting through jars of last year's pickles and early rhubarb preserves. He found her there, lantern light catching in the loose wisps of hair that had slipped from her braid. Your chimney's failing, he said, squatting near the edge of the steps. She looked up from the shelf, her sleeves rolled, hands dusted with soil. Already? It won't hold another freeze. She straightened, brushing her palms against her skirt. I'll fetch the lime and sand next time I go into town. I'll ride in tomorrow. You've got enough here to manage. Her eyes lingered on him a moment. You know what to look for? I helped lay the one at my brother's place. He had a worse draft than yours. Margaret stepped out into the pale morning, closing the cellar door behind her. Tell the mercantile I'll need muslin, too. The hens are laying steady again. He nodded but didn't move right away. Your hands are shaking. She glanced down, surprised. Must be the cold. It's not cold. She said nothing, and he didn't press her. That afternoon, she brought down a faded shawl from the trunk at the foot of her bed. It had belonged to her mother, the fringe worn thin but still soft. She draped it around her shoulders and went out to the orchard behind the barn. The trees had been planted by her husband's hand, years before the drought browned their leaves and stunted their fruit. She walked between them, fingers grazing bark, then stopped and leaned against one where the branches still held promise. I was 19 when we came here, she said, not turning. Nolan had followed but kept his distance, hands tucked into his coat pockets. You miss back east? I miss what I thought it'd be. She turned to face him. We were sure we'd raise a family here. Thought the kind of work made a place sacred. He stepped closer, slow. You still believe that? I don't know. Her voice was quiet. I've stopped wishing for what can't be. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped beside her, his shoulder brushing the tree. I saw you looking at the Jameson place last week when we rode past. You thinking of buying it? She shook her head. No. I was remembering how their daughter used to play fiddle at the spring dances, before the sickness took her. He nodded once. I remember. They stood in the fading light, side by side, the orchard silent around them. The next morning before dawn, Nolan saddled the mule and rode into town. Margaret stayed behind, harvesting the last of the kale from the garden and boiling water to scrub the porch boards. She worked through the morning, not pausing, not thinking. When the wind shifted and brought the scent of smoke from the far hills, she stopped and looked out, half expecting to see him returning already. He came back late in the afternoon, dust on his boots, the mule's pack full. He handed her the muslin, the lime, the sand, and a square of wax paper folded around 2 peppermint sticks. She frowned slightly. That wasn't on the list. It was on mine, he said, and she didn't argue. That evening, she sat at the table, slicing the muslin into strips while he mixed mortar in the yard. The peppermint lay untouched between them. "You ever think about going back to Kansas?" she asked, not looking up. "No one left there for me." "What about your brother?" "His jaw worked. Buried him 2 springs ago. Snakebite." She set her shears down. "You don't talk about it much. Doesn't change anything." "No," she said, "but it matters." He looked across the table at her, eyes steady. "I don't know what I'm building here, Margaret. Not yet. But I know I want to stay long enough to find out." Her fingertips brushed the edge of the peppermint. "Then I'll keep the fire going." The next morning, she woke to the sound of hammering. Nolan was already on the roof, sleeves rolled, mortar bucket beside him. She brought up coffee in a tin cup, and he paused long enough to take it, crouched on the slant of shingles. "Roof solid," he said. "I checked it last fall. You've got a good eye for wear." She gave a half smile. "I've had to." He sipped, then passed the cup back. "You ever think about letting someone else help?" "I'm doing that now, aren't I?" He looked down at her, quiet for a breath. "You are." By dusk, the chimney stood clean and straight again. She watched him wash the grit from his hands at the pump, the last gold of light catching in the lines around his eyes. He caught her watching and crossed the yard with slow steps, stopping in front of her with his palms still damp. "I want to build something with you," he said. "Not just fences or chimneys. Something lasting." Her voice was steady. "That's not a small thing to say. I wouldn't say it if I didn't mean it." She reached for his hand, not delicate, not shy. Their fingers laced together like they'd done it 100 times before. "You've already started," she said. And they stood there in the cooling air on land that had once only held her sorrow, now holding something else. Something growing. The wheatgrass had come in thick along the southern rise, and Margaret bent to pull the last of the thistle from its edge, her hands working through the soil with practiced ease. Nolan was on the ladder again, driving the final nail into the roofline of the lean-to they had raised together over the past 2 weeks. It curved neatly off the cabin's rear wall, not wide but deep enough to hold tools and seed, and maybe one day something more. She pressed a palm to her lower back and straightened. "You'd think we were trying to build a second house, the way you measure every beam twice." He looked down, brushing sawdust from his shirt. "It'll stay standing longer if it's done right the first time." She gave a quiet nod and turned toward the house, already thinking about the potatoes she'd left boiling. The garden had taken better than expected this season, and the hens had laid steady enough that she'd started trading eggs at the mercantile again. The mornings still bit with cold, but there was green pushing up in every corner of the land, and the stillness she used to brace against now felt like quiet company. Inside, she peeled the skins from the potatoes with a dull knife, listening for the sounds of Nolan's hammer to pause. When they finally did, she heard the ladder slide down and the familiar weight of his boots across the porch. He came in with his hair tousled by the wind, sleeves pushed back, and a long splinter riding the curve of his thumb. She reached for his hand before he could speak. "You're not meant to be part of the wood." He stood still while she pulled the sliver free, her touch careful. "You've got good hands," he said, voice even. "I've had years to learn," she replied, not letting go just yet. His eyes held hers. "I wasn't just building that lean-to for tools." She didn't answer. Not right away. She folded the cloth she'd used and set it down gently. "I wondered if you'd say something. I wanted to wait till the roof was on." She stepped back, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the sink. "Say it now." He took a breath, slow and even. I want to stay. Not just for the season. Not just until the next job calls me off. I want to build a life here with you. She crossed the small space between them, both hands now resting on his chest. You already are. The air between them shifted like a long-held breath let out. He leaned down and she met him halfway. The kiss was quiet, sure, and not rushed. When they parted, she pressed her forehead to his. I never thought I'd feel full again. You're not alone in that. That night, they sat on the back stoop, watching the stars clear through the open stretch of sky. The wind had gone still. She leaned against him, head on his shoulder, and he folded his arm around her like he'd always known where it belonged. I've been thinking, he said after a long silence. There's a patch of land past the orchard, flat and open, enough space for another structure. She smiled against his shirt. You planning to keep building forever? He turned his face into her hair. Just the things that matter. They married 2 weeks later, beneath the cottonwood by the creek. No dresses or suits, no preacher from town. Just Margaret, in her cleanest apron, and Nolan, with his shirt pressed and hair combed, holding hands beneath the same tree she'd once wept under alone. She spoke her promise with a clear voice, and he replied with a steady one. They carved their initials into the bark after, side by side with the ones her husband had left years before, not to replace but to join. That summer, the orchard bore fruit again. Small, hardy apples with thick skins and tart flesh. Margaret filled a basket with them one afternoon and brought them inside, setting them on the table beside the peppermint sticks Nolan still brought back from town. He came in behind her, dust on his sleeves, and wrapped his arms around her waist. We should plant more trees. She turned in his arms. We will, but let's let these grow strong first. They spent that evening on the porch, watching the sky turn to dusk over the hills. He read aloud from an old book she'd kept tucked behind the flower bin, his voice low and even. She listened with her bare feet curled beneath her, her hand resting in his. Years passed and the land held them. Margaret's hair silvered at the temples, and Nolan's hands grew rougher with time, but their days never lost their rhythm. They built a second room off the cabin when the winters grew harder and lined it with quilts she sewed from old shirts and flour sacks. The lean-to became a place for seed, then tools, then a cradle made from the same cedar Nolan had hauled down himself. They never rushed anything. Love bloomed the way the stubborn trees did, slow, rooted deep, and sure. And each night, no matter the season, they ended the day the same way, side by side, her hand in his, the wind slipping soft through the grasses outside, and peace, long earned, settling in like a second skin.